All right, let's talk about breast implants. But we're not going to cover the cosmetic side of things today. Nope. We are going deep into the medical story, what really happens when they fail, and maybe more importantly, how doctors can actually see what's happening on the inside. It's pretty fascinating stuff, so let's get right into it. So, right off the bat, pretty much everything we're about to cover really boils down to this one single choice: saline or silicone. You might think, what's the big deal? But trust me, when a problem crops up, their behavior and how doctors figure it all out are worlds apart.
Okay, so first things first, let's lay the foundation. There are really only two types of implants you need to know about, and this one distinction is the key to, well, understanding everything else.
Okay, so in one corner, you have saline implants. Super simple, right? They're basically just filled with sterile salt water. And if one of them ruptures, you know it immediately. The implant just deflates. Silicone, though, that's a whole other animal. It's a thick gel, so a rupture can be completely silent. You might not even know it happened. And finding it requires some much more sophisticated imaging. And it's not just what's in the implant. It's also where it goes. Surgeons have two main spots they can place it. One is subglandular, which is right behind the breast tissue. The other is subpectoral, which is deeper, back behind the chest muscle. And why does this matter to us? Well, it doesn't just change the final look, it completely changes how that implant appears on medical scans, which, as you'll see, is a huge deal for diagnosis.
Now, here's where things get really interesting: how the body itself reacts. See, when a foreign object like a silicone implant shows up, the body's response is honestly remarkable, and it's a critical piece of this whole puzzle. Your body creates what's known as a fibrous capsule. Think of it like a natural, custom-made container made of scar tissue that your body builds to wall off this foreign object. This isn't part of the implant at all. Your body makes it. And here's the crucial part. This only really happens with silicone implants, not saline. And get this, over time, about a quarter of these fibrous capsules will develop tiny little calcifications. Now, I know that word can sound a bit alarming, but it's actually a very common and usually harmless thing that radiologists see all the time on mammograms. Of course, implants aren't perfect. They don't last forever. So let's get to the core of this whole thing. What exactly happens when an implant fails? So the most common issue is something called capsular contracture. Remember that fibrous capsule we just talked about? Well, this is when it starts to tighten up and squeeze, distorting the implant. Then there's gel bleed, which is this slow leak of tiny silicone molecules through a shell that's still intact. It's not a full rupture. The biggest concern, though, is that full rupture. And the number one risk factor is simply the age of the implant. With a saline implant, a rupture is, well, it's pretty straightforward. The implant deflates, so you can see it. The body just harmlessly absorbs the salt water. And on a mammogram, the collapsed shell is plain as day. There's no complex imaging, no real diagnostic mystery. A silicone rupture, however, is a much more dramatic two-act play. First, you get what's called an intracapsular rupture. The implant shell itself breaks, but the silicone gel is still contained by the body's fibrous capsule. But then, if that capsule also breaks, you get an extracapsular rupture, and that's when silicone gel can actually leak out into the surrounding tissue. And this brings us to the golden rule for anyone reading these scans. You absolutely cannot have an isolated extracapsular rupture. It's just not possible. For the silicone to get outside that fibrous capsule, it first had to break through the implant shell. It is always, always a two-step process. Okay, so if these ruptures can be totally hidden, how do doctors actually find them? This is where medical imaging turns into a full-blown detective story, with its own very specific set of clues. First up is the famous Linguine sign, and you can only see this on an MRI. It is the classic signal of an intracapsular rupture. The name is just perfect. It's the collapsed implant shell floating and waving around inside the contained silicone gel, and it looks just like strands of linguine pasta. Now, on an ultrasound, that exact same kind of rupture goes by a different name. It's called the stepladder sign. Instead of wavy lines, you see a series of parallel lines that look like the rungs of a ladder. It's basically the ultrasound equivalent of the Linguine sign. Now, if the rupture is extracapsular, meaning silicone has actually escaped that capsule, ultrasound shows something called the Snowstorm sign. It's this very dense, bright, kind of chaotic pattern that tells you there's free silicone out in the breast tissue or maybe even in nearby lymph nodes. But here's the thing.
Even with all these very specific signs, there's a final twist. A common, perfectly normal feature of an implant can look deceptively like a rupture. So this poses a really critical question for diagnosis, doesn't it? How can a radiologist be absolutely certain they're looking at the Linguine sign of a rupture and not this really convincing imposter? Well, meet the mimic, the radial fold. Because implants are soft and flexible, the shell just naturally folds in on itself sometimes. These folds can be pretty thick, and at first glance on an MRI, they can look a lot like the collapsed lines of a true rupture. And this just shows you the challenge perfectly. On one side, you've got a true rupture with those free-floating linguine lines. On the other, a totally normal radial fold. But the key to telling them apart comes down to asking one very simple question. And here it is, the single most important takeaway. A normal radial fold will always connect back to the outer edge of the implant shell. It has to. But the linguine from a true rupture, that's the broken shell itself, so it just floats freely inside the silicone, completely disconnected. That simple distinction makes the diagnosis.
Understanding these signs and their mimics has really turned a potential silent problem into a visible, solvable puzzle. And it leaves you with a final question, right? As imaging technology gets even more powerful, what new details will we be able to see, and how is that going to continue to change the world of medicine?